Usually when you talk about, like, a city's layout, there's this underlying expectation of innocent urban planning.
Right, yeah.
Like, you look at a map, you see a wide, straight street, and you naturally think, they just wanted to reduce traffic congestion.
Yep.
Or you see a massive public square, and you assume some architect wanted to create a nice, breathable space for Sunday afternoon strolls.
I mean, it's a comforting assumption, right?
Yeah.
We fundamentally want to believe that our infrastructure is politically neutral,
Exactly.
that a road is just a road built for efficiency and public good.
Right, but then you step into the world of 19th century Paris, and suddenly that innocent map just completely dissolves. It is actually a blueprint for a battlefield.
Oh, entirely.
If you know how to read the street grid of Paris from the 1850s and 60s, you realize you aren't looking at urban renewal at all. You are looking at a weapon.
Yeah, you are looking at the absolute textbook definition of architectural counterinsurgency.
Rendered in stone and macadam, right?
Rendered in stone, exactly.
So let's unpack exactly how that happened. Welcome to this deep dive, where we are taking you, the listener, on a really granular, intensely detailed exploration of what we're calling the theoretical prologue.
The essential backstory.
Yeah, exactly. We are diving into the explosive years between 1848 and the establishment of the Second Empire in France. Our mission today is to uncover the precise material, urban, and, well, political preconditions that eventually birthed the famous 1871 Paris Commune.
Right.
Think of this conversation as your shortcut to becoming deeply well-informed on an epoch that literally reshaped the modern world.
And to achieve that level of detail, we are pulling from a really heavy but incredibly illuminating stack of sources today.
Oh, it's a dense stack.
It is. We have the theoretical frameworks laid out by Marxist writers who were observing this stuff in real time, like Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin, and Leon Trotsky. And they are attempting to diagnose the structural anatomy of the state and the flow of capital. But we are pairing that with deeply granular social histories, from texts by Prosper-Olivier, Lissagaray, John Merriman, and Alistair Horn.
Which is so important.
Yeah, because those texts ground those massive theories in the bloody street-level reality of the actual Parisian people.
Right, and before we get into the mechanics of this, I want to pause and make something explicitly clear to you, our listener. Today, we are looking at some incredibly intense source material.
Very intense.
It includes highly charged Marxist theory, concepts of ruthless class warfare, and historical accounts of truly staggering state violence and repression.
Yeah.
So while we aren't here to endorse the Marxist worldview, nor are we here to justify or, endorse the brutal actions of the French state, we are here to impartially unpack exactly how these thinkers viewed the world and what the historical records actually show. Our goal is to understand the mechanics of this explosive era, to figure out why and how these massive societal shifts occurred, strictly based on the texts in front of us.
It's a really vital distinction.
Yeah.
Because to understand the Paris Commune of 1871, you can't just start in 1871.
Right, you'd be totally lost.
Exactly. You have to understand the psychological and material trauma that preceded it. And to do that, we actually have to briefly cast our minds back even further to the original French Revolution of 1789.
Oh, interesting. Why go back that far?
Well, to understand why the Revolution of 1848 was such a horrific shock to the system.
Yeah, and this is where the timeline gets deceptive, I think. Because if you just glance at a history book, you see the French people overthrowing an absolute monarch in 1789, and then roughly 60 years later in 1848, they're overthrowing another monarch.
Right.
It is incredibly tempting to look at that and think, oh, they just pressed the replay button.
Just a sequel.
But the material reality, like the actual daily economic engine of the country, had completely fundamentally transformed between those two dates.
The mechanics of the society were entirely different. Let's look at 1789 first.
Okay.
When the Jacobins and the liberal bourgeoisie came to power, they were expropriating feudal property, abolishing the absolute monarchy, and founding the First Republic. But how did they achieve that physically?
Like who was fighting?
Right. Who was actually in the streets doing the fighting? They relied on the sans-culottes.
And wait, the sans-culottes weren't factory workers, right? I mean, when we think working class today, we think factories.
No, not at all. The factory system didn't really exist in France at that point.
Okay.
The sans-culottes were independent artisans, small tradesmen, craftsmen, journeymen, shopkeepers.
Right, gotcha.
They owned their own tools. Maybe they had a small workshop attached to their home.
Yeah.
So the liberal bourgeoisie, the lawyers, merchants, and wealthy non-nobles, were able to form a political alliance with these independent artisans.
Because they shared a common enemy.
Exactly. The feudal aristocracy that was taxing and suppressing both of them.
Okay, that makes sense. The rich merchant and the local blacksmith both hate the king, so they team up.
Right.
But fast forward to 1848, and you're saying that alliance is totally dead.
It is entirely dead. And it's dead because the economy has shifted beneath their feet.
How so?
By 1848, the Industrial Revolution has firmly taken root in France. We have seen the rapid, aggressive rise of the industrial proletariat.
The factory workers.
Yes. We are no longer dealing with a society primarily made up of small, independent artisans who own their own hammers and anvils.
Right, we're dealing with factories, we're dealing with wage labor, we are talking about tens of thousands of people who own absolutely nothing but their ability to work for 14 hours a day on a machine owned by somebody else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when the Revolution of 1848 kicks off and the liberal bourgeoisie takes power to form the Second Republic, they aren't looking at those helpful, somewhat independent artisan allies from 1789 anymore.
They're looking at a totally different demographic.
Right. They're looking out their windows at a massive, newly formed, utterly impoverished industrial working class.
Wow.
And because of the nature of wage labor versus factory ownership, they come into immediate mortal conflict.
Because the demands were entirely incompatible. I mean, in 1848, the working class wasn't just asking for the king to step down so they could have a nice parliament.
No, not at all.
According to Engels' analysis in our sources, the workers demanded a republic surrounded with social institutions. They were literally demanding the right to work.
Yes.
They wanted the state to guarantee their economic survival.
While the bourgeoisie merely wanted what Engels calls a completed bourgeois government.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they wanted the political power to run the country, to pass laws that favored commerce, banking, and industry without a monarch getting in the way.
Right, just political control.
Yeah, but they had absolutely no intention of redesigning the fundamental economic system to guarantee jobs, regulate wages, or build social safety nets for the factory workers.
Wait, so the bourgeoisie essentially used the working masses as a battering ram to get rid of the monarchy, and the very moment they got the keys to the state, they locked the door behind them.
Yeah.
It's like a massive corporate takeover where the frontline employees execute the buyout, thinking they're getting profit sharing, only to immediately face mass layoffs from the executives they just installed.
That's a great analogy, but honestly, it's actually far more vicious than a simple corporate buyout.
How much worse could it get?
Well, in a corporate takeover, they just fire you and you go home. Here, as we will see, the state used they laid off workers' own taxes to fund a mercenary army to literally shoot them.
Oh my God.
But to your point about locking the door, yes. The Marxist sources are very specific about this dynamic.
Right.
Engels writes that the proletariat had conquered the battlefield, but they had not conquered their emancipation.
Because the economy was still stacked against them.
Exactly. The economic foundation had changed so fundamentally that the workers now constituted an independent, threatening political party. They weren't just the muscle anymore. They had an entirely separate vision for the future of France.
And this ideological split is what drags us into the sheer tragedy of the June days of 1848.
Yes.
Because this theoretical conflict over what a republic should actually do didn't just stay in the debating chambers. It exploded onto the streets in blood.
It did.
And I really want to dig into the mechanics of this, because the state engineered this conflict through a devious, highly calculated manipulation of the working class itself. Let's talk about the national workshops, because this is where the powder keg was built.
Right. The national workshops, or ateliers nationaux, are a masterclass in bureaucratic cruelty.
Okay, tell me about them.
When the 1848 revolution happened, it triggered a massive economic crisis. Capital fled the city, factories shut down, and suddenly you have roughly 100,000 workers thrown onto the streets of Paris with absolutely zero income.
100,000, that's a huge number for that time.
It's staggering. They are starving, and they are armed.
Which is a terrifying prospect for the newly installed provisional government.
Terrifying. So, to pacify them, the government's minister, a guy named Marie, established these national workshops.
Okay.
The name sounds grand, like a massive public works program. But they were a cynical, punitive creation.
How so?
The government took these 100,000 highly skilled artisans and industrial workers and put them to work doing tedious, monotonous, completely unproductive earthworks.
Like what?
They were essentially digging trenches in the morning and filling them back up in the afternoon.
Marx is absolutely scathing about this in the sources. He calls them English workhouses in the open.
Yes, exactly.
The government deliberately made the conditions degrading. They took skilled mechanics, weavers, and carpenters, stripped them of their dignity, and paid them a miserable wage of just 23 sous a day.
Barely enough to survive.
It was a pressure cooker designed to humiliate and exhaust the working class.
But the state knew that humiliation would eventually breed rebellion.
Right, you can only push people so far.
Exactly. So to contain these 100,000 angry, underpaid, centrally located workers, the state needed a specialized, fiercely loyal military force.
Why not just use the regular army?
The regular army wasn't enough, and the bourgeois National Guard was too unreliable. They didn't want to fight in the streets.
Yeah.
And this is where we see the creation of the mobile guard.
And the mechanics of how they built this mobile guard is just staggering. Tell us who these recruits actually were.
The provisional government recruited 24,000 young men, mostly teenagers, aged 15 to 20.
Teenagers?
Yeah, kids. And they didn't recruit them from the middle class. They recruited them straight from the most destitute, declassed elements of the city.
The absolute bottom of the barrel economically.
Right. The Marxist texts refer to this demographic as the lumpen proletariat. It's youth recruited from the mob, individuals without fixed trades, street urchins, the completely marginalized and desperate.
But here's the psychological manipulation, the statistical knife twist that really gets me. While the grown industrial workers in the national workshops were breaking their backs doing pointless earthworks for a starvation wage of 23 sous a day, the government paid these teenagers in the mobile guard a premium of 1.50 francs a day.
Yes.
That is a massive difference in 1848 currency. Plus, they gave them a distinct, flashy uniform.
It is the ultimate divide and conquer strategy.
Yeah.
The state effectively hired the most desperate, disenfranchised youth, gave them a uniform, a massive raise, and 3 square meals a day, and aimed them squarely at the newly unionized industrial workers.
They weaponized the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder against the rung just above it.
Precisely.
It's like funding a private, heavily armed security force out of the very neighborhoods you're gentrifying, paying them triple the local wage, and ordering them to evict their own neighbors.
That is a brilliant way to look at it. But what makes this so deeply tragic is the psychology of the moment.
Yeah.
Because initially, the industrial workers completely misunderstood what was happening.
Wait, really?
Yeah. When you read the contemporary accounts in our sources, they note that as the newly minted mobile guard marched through the streets of Paris, the workers actually cheered for them.
Wait, they cheered for the military force designed to suppress them? Why would they do that?
Because they saw themselves in them.
Oh, wow.
The workers mistook these young men in uniform for a proletarian guard. They saw kids from their own slums, kids they recognized, and they assumed this new force was created to protect the revolution against the conservative bourgeois National Guard.
They thought, these are our sons, they are on our side.
Exactly.
That is heartbreaking, but that illusion shatters in June, doesn't it?
It shatters violently.
Yeah.
By late June of 1848, the provisional government feels strong enough and adequately armed enough to finally drop the hammer.
Right.
They unilaterally ordered the closure of the national workshops. They issued an ultimatum to the 100,000 workers. You either enlist in the regular army, or you will be forcibly dispersed to the provinces to drain swamps.
Which is essentially a death sentence by malaria or cannon fire.
Pretty much.
So backed into a corner, the workers throw up barricades, the June revolt begins. And how does the government respond?
General Eugene Cavaignac is given dictatorial powers, and he unleashes absolutely everything he has.
Yeah.
He sends in the regular army, but more importantly, he sends in the mobile guard. And the fighting is vicious. These teenagers, highly paid and indoctrinated by the state, do not hesitate to open fire on the workers who had cheered them just weeks before.
And we really need to emphasize the scale of the violence here, because when you read about the 19th century, it's easy to gloss over the word skirmish or riot.
Oh, this wasn't a riot.
No, this was a slaughter. What are the actual numbers?
The statistics from the sources are chilling. During the fighting, and crucially, in the summary executions that took place immediately afterward, over 3,000 workers were killed.
3,000 dead.
Yes. And once the barricades fell, the state went house to house. 25,000 people were arrested.
25,000.
And the legal mechanics of what happened next are horrifying. We have to note the role of Jules Favre, a prominent bourgeois politician.
What did he do?
He drew up the infamous June 27th decree, which legally allowed for the mass deportation of insurgents without even the formality of a judicial inquiry.
So no trials, no judges, no defense, just rounded up, put in chains, and shipped across the Mediterranean.
Exactly. Around 11,000 Parisian workers were condemned to prison or deported to brutal forced labor camps in places like Algeria.
Wow.
The intellectual and physical leadership of the Parisian working class was simply excised from the city.
Okay, so let's zoom out and look at the theoretical implications of this bloodshed. What does this all mean for the trajectory of France?
Well, it changes everything.
The sources argue that the June days marked the permanent, irrevocable severing of relations between the French bourgeoisie and the French working class.
Completely.
The romantic illusion of 1789, the idea that the rich lawyer and the poor blacksmith could link arms on the barricades and build a beautiful egalitarian republic together, that idea died on the paving stones in June 1848.
It died completely. The bourgeoisie won the June days. They successfully defended their property and their concept of the republic. They crushed the workers.
Right.
But, and this is where the historical irony really kicks in, the psychological toll on the ruling class was profound.
The sheer scale of the workers' uprising terrified them to their core.
Because they realized just how close they came to losing everything.
Precisely. They realized that a parliamentary democracy, with its constant elections, its free press, its endless public debates, it was entirely too unstable.
It gave the working class too much room to organize, right?
Exactly. They were so utterly terrified of future proletarian uprisings that they decided a democratic republic was a luxury they could no longer afford.
Wow.
They willingly surrendered their own political power to a dictator in order to feel safe.
And this brings us to the rise of Louis Bonaparte, the nephew of the original Napoleon. In December 1851, he executes a coup d'etat.
He does.
He physically dissolves the parliament, arrests the dissenting politicians, and establishes the Second Empire, crowning himself Napoleon III.
Right.
Now, if we look at the theoretical texts from Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky, they don't just call this a dictatorship. They use a very specific, deeply analytical term for this kind of regime, which is Bonapartism.
Right. And Bonapartism, as defined in these Marxist texts, is a highly specific political phenomenon. It doesn't just mean any dictatorship.
How is it different?
It occurs in a very particular set of material circumstances. It happens when the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, is no longer able to maintain its rule through democratic or parliamentary means because they are too unpopular.
Yeah.
But the working class is not yet strong enough, or in this case, has just been crushed too severely, to take power themselves.
So there's a deadlock. Neither major class can definitively rule the other through normal means.
Exactly. And in that deadlock, the state apparatus itself becomes somewhat autonomous.
It takes on a life of its own.
Right. The executive power, embodied in a single dictator, rises up and maneuvers between the different classes.
Playing them against each other. Yes. The Bonapartist leader appears as a supreme arbiter, a national savior standing above society. He throws a few bones to the peasants, flatters the military, suppresses the workers, and promises order to the rich.
While ultimately doing what?
While ultimately, structurally, protecting the fundamental foundations of capitalist property.
Let me see if I can translate this with an analogy, because the concept of the bourgeoisie cheering for their own disenfranchisement is wild.
It really is.
Is Bonapartism essentially a macro-level mafia protection racket?
A mafia racket, how do you mean?
Well, imagine you own a highly profitable but very vulnerable factory in a neighborhood where all the locals hate you because you pay terrible wages.
Okay.
You try to run the neighborhood council democratically, but the locals keep voting to strike, or they riot and threaten to burn your factory down. You are terrified. So, you go to the local mob boss. You say, I will give up my seat on the council. You can run the whole neighborhood. You can take a massive cut of my profits to fund your goons. But in exchange, you have to stand outside my factory with a baseball bat and make sure the workers never unionize and never threaten my property.
I see.
You are voluntarily giving up your political freedom to a violent thug because that thug is the only one brutal enough to guarantee your economic safety.
That is a remarkably accurate, if colorful, distillation of what Trotsky and Marx are arguing.
Really?
Yes. Trotsky explicitly states that Bonapartism is the final form of bourgeois power.
Which sounds like a paradox.
And this is the brilliant paradox you're highlighting. To save their wealth, the bourgeoisie realized they had to sacrifice their political power. Marx notes that to save its purse, the The bourgeoisie must forfeit its crown.
Because they needed to protect what Marx calls the empire of agio. And we should probably explain that term because it sounds really esoteric, but it's crucial. What is the empire of agio?
Agio refers to the premium on currency, or more broadly in this context, rampant stock exchange speculation.
Okay, so high finance.
Exactly. During the 1850s, France was experiencing a massive boom in industrial capitalism. The building of railroads, telegraph lines, heavy industry. The Parisian stock exchange was just exploding.
Everyone's getting rich.
The bourgeoisie were making absolute fortunes in speculation. But stock markets hate instability. They hate riots. They hate the uncertainty of parliamentary elections where a socialist might win a seat.
So the bourgeoisie looks at Louis Bonaparte and says, take the parliament, just keep the stock market climbing.
Exactly that. Lenin later expanded on this dynamic. He wrote that in a Bonapartist republic, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but entirely surely, through the direct corruption of officials and an alliance between the government and the stock exchange.
So they don't need to be politicians anymore.
Right. The bourgeoisie didn't need to sit in parliament debating laws if they controlled the purse strings, and if the state used its massive military apparatus to suppress any threat to their investments.
But let's look at the actual anatomy of this massive military apparatus, because a mafia boss needs a lot of goons to keep a city like Paris quiet.
Oh, a massive amount.
The sources describe a state machine that is entirely parasitic.
Parasitic is the perfect word, and the scale is almost hard to comprehend. The texts note that Napoleon III's state employed 500,000 bureaucratic officials.
500,000, just pushing paper and spying.
Exactly, and on top of that, he maintained a standing army of another 500,000 men.
Wow.
That is 1,000,000 men whose sole job is to enforce order, extract taxes, and maintain the regime. It was a suffocating layer of bureaucracy and military might pressing down on French society.
And the quality of the leadership commanding this apparatus was shockingly corrupt.
Deeply corrupt.
The sources describe a regime built on adventurism and demagogy. Louis Bonaparte didn't rely on principled statesmen. He utilized political terrorism, widespread corruption, and even explicitly criminal elements. I'm thinking of the secret Bonapartist Society of December 10th, the so-called Decembrists.
Right, the Decembrists were effectively Louis Bonaparte's private gang.
Like actual gangsters.
Basically, yeah. Before his coup, he organized this secret society composed of exactly the same kind of lumpen proletariat that had made up the mobile guard, thieves, vagabonds, ruined roués.
And what did he use them for?
He paid them to stage spontaneous rallies for him, to beat up political opponents in the streets, and to act as agents provocateurs. He institutionalized street thuggery.
And this moral decay extended straight to the top of the military. Marx points out the French Army Command, specifically targeting the war minister, Marshal Saint Arnaud.
Oh, Saint Arnaud.
Tell us about Saint Arnaud, because he really embodies the rot of the Second Empire.
He really does. Marshal Saint Arnaud was the man Louis Bonaparte trusted to physically execute the 1851 coup.
Okay.
And his background is deeply telling. He didn't make his career in glorious European campaigns. He made it in the brutal colonial conquest of Algeria, serving in the Foreign Legion.
Which was a rough crowd.
Very. Marx is incredibly descriptive here. He describes this element of the Foreign Legion as being formed by notorious desperados, adventurers of broken fortune, deserters from all countries, the general offal of the European armies.
So the man leading the French military, the man responsible for securing the capital for the dictator, is essentially a mercenary who spent his career leading violent outcasts in a colonial bloodbath.
Exactly. This was the caliber of men leading the Bonapartist state. It was a regime of violent opportunists protecting the stock portfolios of the panicked elite.
Okay, so that establishes the political and economic mechanics. We have a dictatorial police state installed to protect capitalist speculation by suppressing the working class.
Right.
But Napoleon III was a very pragmatic man. He realized that 500,000 soldiers and all the secret police in the world wouldn't save him if the literal physical geometry of Paris still favored the rebels.
No, the streets themselves were the enemy.
Right. He looks at a map of the city and he sees a tactical nightmare.
Which brings us to the physical legacy of the Second Empire, Haussmannization.
Yes, let's get into this.
Because Napoleon III didn't just want to police the Parisians, he wanted to physically reconstruct the very ground they walked on.
A total overhaul.
He appointed Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann as the prefect of the Seine and gave him dictatorial powers over the city's infrastructure. Together, they embarked on the most massive, unprecedented and violent rebuilding of a city in modern European history.
Now, if you read the official government brochures from the time, or honestly even some superficial tourist guides today, this massive project was pitched purely as modernization.
Of course.
And to be historically objective, they did have three stated goals, and the first two seem perfectly reasonable on the surface. The first was sanitation.
And Paris desperately needed it. The medieval center of the city was a labyrinth of dark, damp, incredibly narrow alleys.
Not very healthy.
No, there was virtually no sunlight, the sewage ran openly in the streets, and the water supply was tainted. As a result, Paris had been ravaged by catastrophic cholera outbreaks in 1832 and again in 1849, killing tens of thousands.
Wow.
Haussmann argued that they needed to tear down the slums to let light and air into the city, to build underground sewers and aqueducts.
Okay, fighting cholera is a good public relations angle. The second goal was the free flow of capital and goods. We mentioned the booming economy. The Second Empire saw the rise of the first great French department stores, massive emporiums of consumerism like Bon Marché and Printemps.
Right.
But you can't have a booming retail economy if your delivery carts are stuck in medieval traffic jams and your wealthy shoppers are afraid to walk down dark alleys.
Precisely. Haussmann's vision of wide boulevards lined with trees, glittering cafes, and brasseries became the commercial face of modern Paris.
It sounds beautiful.
It was, and it facilitated consumerism, transportation, and tourism on a scale never seen before.
Yeah.
It greased the wheels of the empire of Agio.
Right. Sanitation and shopping. It sounds like a lovely progressive urban renewal project.
On paper, it's rare.
But the third goal, and according to the deep dive into our sources, the most critical driving force for the regime was explicit counterinsurgency. If we look closely, this is counterinsurgency, cleverly disguised as urban renewal. It's highly reminiscent of highway construction in mid-20th century America.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
Right, where planners intentionally bulldozed massive interstates directly through thriving minority neighborhoods to divide, displace, and conquer those communities under the guise of improving traffic.
Yeah.
But here, in 1850s Paris, Haussmann is explicitly designing streets as literal artillery shooting galleries.
The tactical layout is undeniable, and it directly responds to the trauma of 1848.
Oh, so?
To understand why Haussmann designed the streets the way he did, we have to understand the mechanics of a 19th century barricade. Between 1827 and 1848, Parisians had successfully built barricades and fought the army on 8 separate occasions.
8 times. How exactly does one build a barricade? Walk us through the physical reality of it in a medieval street.
Well, in the old, narrow, winding streets of central and eastern Paris, streets that were sometimes only 2 or 3 meters wide, a handful of determined workers could halt an entire regiment.
Just a few guys.
Yeah, they would literally pry up the heavy cobblestones from the street. They would fell trees, overturn massive wooden omnibuses and delivery carts, and drag furniture out of their apartments.
Just throwing anything they could find.
They piled all this up, reinforced it with earth, and created a wall. Because the streets were narrow and crooked, the army couldn't see past the next corner.
Right.
They couldn't maneuver large blocks of infantry, and most importantly, they couldn't use artillery effectively. You can't shoot a cannonball around a sharp corner.
It leveled the playing field. It allowed a poorly armed populace to hold off a professional military.
Exactly.
So Haussmann looks at this geometry and says, let's change the math. His solution was to demolish the medieval labyrinth and replace it with incredibly wide, perfectly straight boulevards.
You cannot build a barricade across an avenue that is 30 meters wide. You simply don't have enough carts and furniture to span the gap.
It's too far.
And even if you manage to build one, the army can just set up a battery of cannons half a mile down the perfectly straight road, stay entirely out of musket range, and blow your barricade to pieces with artillery fire.
Furthermore, if you look at a map of Haussmann's Paris, these new boulevards didn't just run parallel, they intersected at oblique angles, creating these massive star-shaped intersections like the étoile.
Yes.
This wasn't just for aesthetic grandeur. It provided troops with clear, sweeping lines of sight and the tactical ability to outflank any defensive position.
Right. If insurgents held one street, the army could simply march down 2 intersecting avenues and attack them from the rear.
And the regime was obsessive about this counterinsurgency design down to the very materials they used. There is a deeply telling anecdote in the sources regarding Queen Victoria's visit to Paris in 1855.
Yes, the macadam.
Yeah. She was being driven through the newly reconstructed city, and with her acute eye, she noted that the streets were newly paved with macadam.
Which is a type of smooth, compacted stone surface.
Right, rather than traditional cobblestones. And it wasn't just to give the queen a smoother carriage ride.
Not at all. It was specifically laid down so that insurgents could no longer easily pry up the heavy paving stones to build their barricades.
That is just wild.
The regime literally changed the chemical composition of the street surface to stop rebellions.
That is staggering. The very ground was weaponized. But I want to push back on the ultimate effectiveness of this because the irony here is incredibly rich.
Oh, the irony is massive.
Haussmann spends millions of francs. He destroys the historic center of the city. He builds these massive, unbarricadable sniper alleys. But when the Paris Commune finally does rise up in 1871, the workers still manage to fortify the city. They adapt to the new geography.
They absolutely adapt.
Yeah.
Human ingenuity in the face of oppression is remarkable. The sources detail how communards applied scientific and engineering principles to the new wide boulevards. They mention figures like Napoleon Gaillard, a humble shoemaker, but also a brilliant member of the International, who oversaw the construction of massive, scientifically designed barricades during the Commune.
So these weren't just piles of furniture anymore.
No. Because the streets were wider, they built fortresses. Some of these barricades in 1871 were walls of earth and paving stones up to 5 feet high and 4 feet thick, complete with defensive ditches in front of them and firing parapets.
Factual fortification.
Yes, they were serious military redoubts.
But, and this is the tragic reality we have to acknowledge, when we get to the bloody week of 1871, Haussmann's design ultimately did work as intended, didn't it?
It did. Despite the brilliance of Gaillard's barricades, Haussmann's geometry won.
Yeah.
When the Versailles troops, the reactionary army sent to crush the Commune, entered the city, they rarely had to attack these formidable barricades head-on.
They just went around them.
Exactly. The wide intersecting boulevards allowed the military commanders to easily bypass the heavily fortified positions, outflank the defenders by moving down parallel avenues, and penetrate quickly into the heart of the city.
Oh.
The architecture did its grim job perfectly.
So Haussmann successfully built a city optimized for state violence. But you cannot demolish the medieval center of a major European capital without violently displacing the hundreds of thousands of people who live there.
Right.
The physical rebuilding of the city didn't just change the streets, it fundamentally altered the socioeconomic geography of Paris, creating a massive social pressure cooker. And this leads us to the final and perhaps most crucial set of preconditions, the economic realities of the segregated city.
The sheer scale of destruction during Haussmannization is almost hard to fathom today. The project entailed the demolition of roughly 20,000 buildings, which contained approximately 100,000 apartments.
100,000 apartments gone.
Yes, this was an act of aggressive, state-sponsored gentrification on an apocalyptic scale.
And these weren't empty buildings. They displaced the working class out of central Paris. Areas like the Ile de la Cité, right in the shadow of Notre Dame, had previously housed a dense, vibrant population of artisans, day laborers, and street vendors.
A whole community.
But Haussmann demolished their homes to build the massive prefecture of police and new commercial center.
And they didn't just disappear, obviously. They had to go somewhere.
Right.
And because they were priced out of the new glittering center, they were pushed out to the geographic margins of the city. They were pushed into the outer periphery, into what were then suburban villages, which were subsequently annexed into the city proper.
Which created a very specific demographic map.
Yes, this forced migration created what became known as the Red Belt.
The Red Belt. We're talking about neighborhoods in the north and east of Paris. Places like Belleville, Montmartre, La Villette, and Menilmontant.
Yes. Because all the displaced workers flooded into these specific areas, they transformed from quiet suburbs into highly concentrated, deeply impoverished working-class ghettos.
It was just packed.
The population density reached absolutely staggering levels. In some areas, like the 4th arrondissement, the sources note there were 15,000 people crammed into a single square kilometer.
Just visualize the spatial reality of that. 15,000 people per square kilometer. They were crammed into tiny, squalid rooming houses, what the French called garnis, a family of 6 living in a single, unventilated room.
Miserable conditions.
And while they're living in these miserable conditions, looking down from the hills at the glittering, wealthy new boulevards of central Paris, the economic squeeze on their daily lives was becoming intolerable.
The economic data from the sources paints a desperate picture. As Paris became the center of this new consumer empire, inflation skyrocketed. Rents in the city doubled under the Second Empire.
Doubled.
The overall cost of living shot up by 45%.
But I'm guessing wages didn't keep pace.
Not even close. Wage growth lagged severely behind at only 30%. So every single day, the working class was losing purchasing power.
They were just bleeding money.
They were working longer hours in the factories, yet they could afford less bread and less coal. The statistics reveal a society on the brink of mass starvation.
Tell me the numbers on that.
By 1870, just before the Commune, almost 500,000 Parisians, that is roughly 1/4 of the entire population of the city, were officially classified as indigent or wholly reliant on state charity just to survive the winter.
1/4 of the city is destitute. That's 450,000 of people, angry, starving, and violently displaced, crammed into these incredibly dense peripheral neighborhoods.
Yes.
And in the squalor, a very specific type of social institution begins to take on a massive political significance, which is the local cabaret.
The cabarets and cafes of the Red Belt became the absolute lifeblood of the working class. You have to remember, their apartments in the Garnets were too small, too cold, and too crowded to spend any actual time in.
They just needed somewhere to sit.
Right. The traditional public spaces of the city center were gone, replaced by expensive bourgeois brasseries they couldn't afford. So after a brutal 14-hour shift, the workers congregated in these cheap, cramped, smoke-filled cabarets in Belleville and Montmartre.
And they weren't just going there to drink cheap wine.
No. These spaces became the nerve centers of white-hot political resentment and organization. Because everyone in the room was experiencing the exact same economic trauma, the conversations naturally turned to politics.
Of course.
They read the socialist press aloud to those who were illiterate. They debated the theories of Proudhon and Marx. They formed mutual aid societies, and eventually sections of the First International.
Okay, so let's trace the logic of this, because I think we've uncovered a massive, fatal flaw in the state's design.
Let's hear it.
Haussmann built these wide streets specifically to stop rebellions in the center of the city. He wanted to break up the tight-knit medieval neighborhoods where barricades were easy to build. But by pricing all the workers out of the center and forcibly pushing them into the exact same neglected, overflowing, geographically isolated peripheral neighborhoods, didn't he just accidentally build the perfect incubator for the commune?
That is exactly the profound conclusion drawn by historian Alistair Horn in our sources. Haussmann, in his obsession with security and capital flow, fundamentally defeated his own purpose.
How ironic.
Old Paris, for all its flaws and medieval squalor, actually had a high degree of intimate, mixed-class living. The wealthy merchant might live on the spacious first floor of building, while the poor artisan lived in the attic of that very same building.
So they shared a roof.
Right, they passed each other on the stairs. There was a daily physical friction between the classes that somewhat mitigated unified radicalization.
But the new Paris destroyed that.
It destroyed it entirely. Haussmann replaced that mixed-class intimacy with a resentful, rigid geographic apartheid. By concentrating all the marginalized, starving, furious workers into these specific, highly dense areas like Montmartre and Belleville, Haussmann inadvertently made the ideological and logistical organization of a revolt far easier than it had ever been.
He practically organized them himself.
He essentially grouped his enemies together, gave them a shared grievance, and isolated them from the rest of the city. The state created a unified, geographically contiguous working class, primed and ready to rise up together.
Wow.
When the spark of 1871 finally lit, the Red Belt exploded as a single, unified entity.
It is a breathtaking historical case of unintended consequences. The very measures the dictatorship took to prevent a revolution ended up forging the exact demographic weapon that would nearly destroy them.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize this incredible journey we've been on. We started by looking at how the material realities of France shifted from the artisan economy of 1789 to the brutal industrial capitalism of 1848.
Right.
That economic shift created an irreconcilable ideological split between the liberal bourgeoisie and the newly formed industrial proletariat.
Which led directly to the explosion of the June days.
Yeah.
The state cynically used the national workshops to humiliate the workers and then recruited the most desperate youth, the mobile guard, to slaughter them.
Right.
The barricades were washed in blood, and the illusion of class collaboration was shattered forever.
And the trauma of that slaughter terrified the elite so deeply that they opted for the mafia protection racket of Bonapartism.
Yes, exactly.
They traded their democracy, their parliament, and their political voices for the dictatorship of Napoleon III, simply to ensure that a massive military police state would keep the workers suppressed and their stock market climbing.
And that dictatorship, flush with capital and paranoid about security, then literally bulldozed the medieval center of Paris.
The Haussmannization.
Right. Haussmann used macadam paving and the geometry of wide boulevards to optimize the city for artillery fire and troop movements, trying to physically engineer revolution out of existence.
But in doing so, they violently displaced the working class, pushing them into the suffocating, impoverished ghettos of the Red Belt. They created a segregated city, inadvertently forging the highly concentrated, ideologically unified, and deeply resentful communities that would ultimately ignite the Paris Commune in 1871.
It really is an amazing sequence of events.
It's an incredibly dense, fascinating chain of cause and effect. It shows us how material economic realities shape political theory, which in turn literally shapes the physical architecture of our world, which then creates the environment for the next wave of revolution.
Beautifully put.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to take away and mull over. We've just spent this entire deep dive seeing how Baron Haussmann used macadam paving, street geometry, and geographic displacement as a literal form of architectural crowd control in the 1850s.
Right.
He used infrastructure to preemptively suppress the population. Today, we hear endless, breathless buzz from tech companies and city planners about the rise of smart cities.
Oh, indeed. Cities built entirely on data, efficiency, and constant connectivity.
Exactly. Cities where every intersection has algorithmic surveillance cameras, where public squares are increasingly privately owned and monitored, where our transit systems and infrastructure are fully digitized and controlled from central hubs.
Sounds familiar.
We are told this is for our safety, our sanitation, and the free flow of commerce, the exact same justifications Haussmann used.
That is a chilling parallel.
So we have to ask ourselves, are we just living in the digital equivalent of Haussmann's Paris? Is the invisible architecture of the modern smart city, the algorithms, the surveillance networks, the spatial gating, being quietly designed to preemptively shut down the barricades of the future?
A really important question.
When the next great social pressure cooker explodes, will we find that the streets have already been engineered against us? It is something profound to mull over the next time you walk down a perfectly straight, widely paved, camera-lined avenue. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the theoretical prologue of the Paris Commune. We have laid the groundwork, and the stage is set. We'll catch you next time.